Hello, everybody. Last time we were together, we spoke quite a bit about Froebel and his co-theorist, Pestalozzi. I want to move forward a little bit in time because after we start to think about what children need after such things as country upheaval, we start to really think about how do we systematize care and early education for young children. After German work of Froebel came to America, there were many scholars that started to take up this work. Froebel was testing his games and toys for boys. He was also developing his gifts and preoccupations, and he was very interested in children's play. Because education was for the idea of the rights of the child and the ability of children to have an education, this idea came to America by way of Elizabeth Parker Peabody. She was someone who was very influenced by him. She was a transcendentalist. In other words, she was the same kind of person who hung around with Nathaniel Hawthorne and Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and other types of people like that. She was an activist and a writer. She was an editor of an abolitionist newspaper. She believed that children should receive training to his or her innate capacities. So once we start looking at children receiving training, we start to think about how do they fit in the modern day social workforce, for example, and how do we educate groups of children. So Elizabeth Parker Peabody was born in 1804. She took some of Froebel's teachings. She was a wealthy woman born to a father who was an abolitionist and someone from the East Coast, Boston in particular. She was very political. Her parents were quite wealthy. She was working in the women's suffragette movement, and she was also an active person who had her own library and bookstore in Boston. She was a publisher of books and other types of writing material like newspapers and magazines, when other people, especially women, were very much not recognized in the business world. So she helped some of those early thinkers of the Transcendentalist movement put some of their ideas into press. So Henry David Thoreau's first book was called Civil Disobedience, and it's probably no accident that she supported people who were free thinkers. She helped many intellectuals of our day. She was also the sister-in-law of Nathaniel Hawthorne, and she was related to Horace Mann, who was an educational reformer. She kept very famous company, but her own identity was somewhat significant. She was effective in movements like abolitionist movement, religious movements. She worked for Native American civil rights and women's rights. She was one of the first Americans in the kindergarten movement to really look at the movement to help children nationally. She brought some of those play center practices from Froebel to the U.S., and she had influence in the early part of our 19th century in bringing children's appropriate training into an educational movement. She was very interested in moral reasoning and also religious education. She did not really distinguish moral teaching and religious teaching, but she really believed in teaching for intellectual processes throughout the life. She wrote a book called The First Lessons in Grammar on the Plan of Pestalozzi, and this was one of the works that allowed teachers in Boston and in other parts of the East Coast and Maine to understand kindergarten methods. So Mrs. Peabody was very influential. A little bit after her time was also a very famous person named Susan Blow. As Elizabeth Parker Peabody was suggesting conferences and parties for women, there was usually lecturing, dialogues, reading on a particular topic, and someone like Elizabeth Parker Peabody published one of our first magazines called The Kindergarten Messenger. She set up a Froebel Union, and so you can see that her education was to help people. and it was in concert with other types of human rights. Susan Blow was one of the first people in the Midwest to really influence this part of the country, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, the Midwest part of the states, to become mindful of kindergarten and young children's needs. She was interested in Froebel and opened some of the first kindergartens in the St. Louis area. She taught kindergarten children and teachers as well. She devoted her life to children's pleasure, and she was very influential. She spread the kindergarten movement from the East Coast into the Midwest. She was a lecturer at Teacher College Columbia, very well traveled. Her father, in particular, fought in the Civil War, and he was a high-ranking general, and so she had many affiliations with travel, including going to parts of Europe and Germany, and she got to experience directly some of Froebel's ideas and methods. She transcended and used some of the gifts and occupations here and the handwork here in the United States. She's important in American education, and she's also important as the progressive era starts to take form. So I'm going to go on from there to some photographic images. This particular image is of the soldiers' children, and you can see that this is a poster devoted to illustrating the rights of children. You see these children have bare feet. You see that they're wandering. You see an older brother's caring for a younger brother. And this was to help the public understand the concerns of children, the social plights of children. Now keep in mind, most of the time these particular needs of social welfare were probably taken care of through the identities of people like the church, orphanages, other kinds of public services. This is another historical image from that time period. Keep in mind the camera was not yet public use, and so paintings and other artwork usually depicted the world of children. This is from the pre-1800s. It's after the post-Enlightenment, but it also has a caption called "Welcome Home, Papa." So you can see that the nuclear family is starting to emerge as a social practice. This is actually from the early 20th century, and obviously it's a photograph. It's called More Than First Steps, and this is a child working on a sit of boardwalk with a female looking on, two females actually having a conversation. So you can see that this is probably about at the time of the emergence of the progressive era. These are much older. The date is unknown, but what's interesting here is this particular grandmotherly or motherly figure has a Bible, and this might be a governess, it might be a teacher, but it's one child in particular, perhaps a girl, perhaps a boy. So you can still see that there's this idea of the adult being the child's helper or teacher. And this is a different picture. You can only see part of it. I'm sorry about that. Actually, it's a child on a farm, and it's very different than the one we saw just a few minutes ago. It's not particularly well positioned in this set of slides, but the child is on the ground with bare feet. The mother is looking on. One of the concerns that people in the early 1800s and early 1900s had, late 1800s, is the idea of children doing work. And so you see in these pictures children taking part in the workforce, and on the left you see children doing something that looks like maybe threshing wheat and contributing to some farming practice. Maybe they're shucking corn, and you see them right alongside the adults in there. And then you see some pictures of boys, also working boys, and the one in the middle is smoking a cigar. And so you can kind of see that this particular time frame, children weren't necessarily treated like children in the way we think of this. So this modern early childhood is kind of something that's new, because the labor movement at that particular time came into full view. Children's labor movement was a symptom of the Enlightenment because children didn't necessarily have a special place before that time period. And depending on the social class of the child, you would see the child doing work like adults. Obviously, young and small fingers are more nimble, and specialized jobs for children were found throughout the workforce. Children were much more visible in the workforce, and in these pictures you see children on the right who are either chimney sweeps or coal miners, and then you see children, the child on the left who's a shoeshine boy. Probably you can see that the health and welfare of these children was quite fragile, and children's health and welfare as a movement was only coming into populace mind in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And so you can see that there are many connections here to children, but they're not necessarily the way we see children today. The next time we meet, we'll be speaking about Jane Addams, and she brings us all the way up into the progressive era of the present. Thank you. Only 11 minutes.